Welcome to the Options Save Lives weekly live stream, where we spend an hour each week exploring life-improving topics through a lens of alcohol recovery and the Sinclair method. Every week, we take on a new question, topic, or common challenge to empower people to either build a better relationship with alcohol or to eliminate it completely. Episodes are filmed live on Twitch at twitch.tv/C3 Foundation, and the audience is encouraged to ask questions and engage with the host and guests. The Options Save Lives weekly stream is hosted by Executive Director Jenny Williamson and is produced by the C3 Foundation with the support of R Street Institute and other generous sponsors. For more information about the C3 Foundation or the Sinclair method, visit our website at c3foundation.org. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Options Save Lives weekly live stream. As always, I am Jenny Williamson, Executive Director here at the C3 Foundation and your host for the next hour. How is everyone today? We are broadcasting live from the C3 Foundation office in Fort Myers, Florida, and I'd love to know where you guys are watching from. And if you are a first-timer to the stream, please let us know and let us know where you're from. Thank you for the sound check, Freddie. I appreciate that. So this week, we're going to talk about the intersection of traumatic stress and addiction with Gabrielle Loomis-Annett. We wanted to talk about this today because trauma and addiction often go hand in hand. Sometimes the traumatic stress is easy to identify, but other times it may be more subtle. So if you have any questions while we're talking, if you have any suggestions that have helped you personally, please put those in the chat box so we can keep things interactive. We are really hoping that you guys really interact today. And so before we jump in, let me properly introduce our guest. Gabrielle Loomis-Annett is an advanced alcohol and drug counselor and licensed professional clinical counselor. She is also EMDR trained and a certified clinical trauma professional. Gabrielle has worked in the addiction field for over 12 years in a variety of settings, including residential, outpatient, private practice, and telehealth settings. Gabrielle's focus has always been to understand the complex nature of the addiction-trauma connection and to help individuals break free from these constraints. Using cutting-edge evidence-based tools and a tailored approach to counseling, Gabrielle has been able to help hundreds of individuals break the cycle of addiction and gain greater happiness and peace in their lives. Gabrielle first became familiar with the Sinclair method in 2016 and became a counselor at a TSM outpatient center in 2015. I'm guessing those are probably switched dates. Yes. Since then, she's helped many clients successfully transition from problematic drinking to managed drinking or abstinence using TSM. Her experience has shown her that medication-assisted treatment allows for an individualized approach to recovery and helps people reach their goals more successfully. Gabrielle is a member of the National Association for Addiction Professionals, International Association of Trauma Professionals, EMDR International Association, American Counseling Association, California LPCC Association, and the National Association of Women Business Owners, and is licensed in California, Arizona, and North Carolina. She currently resides in San Diego with her husband and 2 therapy dogs, Teddy and Betty. Gabrielle's hobbies include hiking, biking, yoga, and stand-up paddleboarding. So everybody, let's welcome Gabrielle to the show.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk about this topic today. It's an important one.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you, mostly because as hard as we're trying, so few and far between, we just struggle to get those who are focused in the mental health profession to really embrace the Sinclair method. So we love the fact that you are part of our network, that you're out there helping people every day with the Sinclair method, and that you're specializing in this very critical area. But before we jump fully into our topic today, so we've let me tell you, we've got our international audience. We've got Hungary. We've got England. I think we've got Wales out there. We've got West Coast United States. So you're speaking to the world today.
Right.
And our general audience is used to us starting with an easy icebreaker. So if you had a superpower, what would it be?
Well, that's a good one. The first thing that comes to mind is I was a huge Wonder Woman fan as a child. Like Linda Carter rocked it, right? So I don't know if I would pick just one of her superpowers, but I would like to have all of them or be Wonder Woman as a superhero.
Honestly, Wonder Woman is that's a great one.
I've gone as Wonder Woman for Halloween a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I I'm guessing by the fact that our Wonder Woman is the same Wonder Woman. We're probably about
Yeah,
the same age there,
same
and yeah,
generation,
Wonder
yes.
Woman and the Bionic Woman. I was just telling
Yeah,
somebody the other day that was it for me when I was a kid. So
yeah.
I'd go with either of those. So yeah. So before we really dive in, I can you take a few moments to define traumatic stress? Because
Sure.
I think a lot of people immediately think PTSD and that's it. So if
Mhm.
you could start by just kind of laying that foundation for the audience.
Sure. So, I think it's a couple of different things. So, a lot of people are familiar with PTSD, and that's a good thing, right? So, we're certainly, we've come a long way in the last 30, 40 years in terms of understanding traumatic stress. But basically, traumatic stress is when our brains and bodies are locked into a way of reacting to life that is from a trauma perspective. So most of us are familiar with fight, flight, or freeze, right? So that's a reaction that we have when we are threatened in some way or there's a perception of threat. And so our brain and particularly, our nervous system then reacts with one of those three options. So traumatic stress is when we kind of get locked into that way of reacting. So whatever the event was is over, but our nervous system and our brain really hasn't reset. And so therefore we are continuing to react to present day circumstances as if we are still in that event. So that's really kind of in general what traumatic stress is. And it can look different for different people. Um, and it could, last anywhere from days, weeks, and months to years and decades.
And I love that you actually included the third piece there because so often people go to just fight or flight. And
Mhm.
freeze, I think, is often overlooked. So
Sure.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that one as well. But what made you decide to specialize in both traumatic stress and addiction? Because both of those are really heavy.
Yeah, and I feel like I am a bit of a unicorn in that sense. But it really just came from my personal experience. And counseling and mental health is a second career for me. And it was the result of my own life changing experience with trauma therapy. So it took me about 10 years to get a proper diagnosis that I, in fact, was dealing with complex PTSD and to receive the right help and the right treatment from a trauma specialist. And when I did, I mean, it was just life changing. There's just no other way to really put that. And from that experience, I felt two things. I felt one that it was so impactful for me that I wanted to make a difference in other people's lives in the same way. But second, why did it take 10 years for me to get the right help? I feel like I really kind of struggled through like late adolescence and early adulthood, and that was unnecessary. So that's what really sparked it for me. I found a master's degree program that allowed me to concentrate in traumatic stress, which is pretty rare. So I went into the counseling field knowing I wanted to work with traumatic stress. And from there, after I graduated, I kind of like got my business card and hung out my shingle. And I was like, okay, all the people with traumatic stress, come find me. And no one did. And I went, oh, right. This is part of why I was not diagnosed properly for 10 years. People don't realize that they're dealing with traumatic stress. People still have the misnomer that you only have PTSD if you were, in combat. And so from there, I went, okay, where do I find the people that are dealing with traumatic stress? Where are the sort of the highest incidences of that? And that is an addiction. And so that is really how all of that came about. And when I started working in the addiction field, it was, it was pretty brand new to even have somebody that was a trauma specialist in that setting. It's addiction treatment has really changed quite a bit, but at that time it was pretty novel. And so I knew that was where I needed to be. I knew that that's where there was a void, and that people who were struggling with addiction really needed this type of more in-depth mental health care in addition to working with their addiction.
And and I'm sure the statistics on this are probably horrendous. Can you share what does the numerical picture look like?
Yeah, and I wish there was a study that could sort of take in all factors and give us that clear number. But obviously, populations are different, so there's a lot of different statistics out there around the correlation. The one that I often refer to most is that individuals with lifetime PTSD, so kind of what we call complex PTSD, 50% of those individuals also meet the criteria for substance use disorder. And because both of these are often underreported, my experience is that number is a lot higher. And in my years of kind of working in the field, it's 100%. It's, and people who are struggling with, a substance use chronically, meaning they have been unsuccessful, they have, multiple treatment attempts. There really is a very high correlation. It's also interesting to note that women oftentimes have a higher correlation as well. And so it's sort of the chicken or the egg scenario, meaning that when people experience trauma, they're 2 to 4, sometimes even 8 times as likely to have substance issues. And then when people have substance issues, they're also more likely to experience trauma. So the two just really go hand in hand. One study also too that I do like to talk about or sort of cite the statistic from when they did studies with Vietnam veterans, and their connection between trauma and substance use is 74%. So 74% of veterans with PTSD also had substance use disorder. So again, we've got some studies that show anywhere from 50 to 75%. My anecdotal clinical experience is it's 99.99%.
So with numbers that high, why is it so difficult for people to realize that they are suffering through traumatic stress?
Yeah, I think because people think about PTSD and they think about the most severe or acute forms of it. And they only sort of compare themselves to that set of criteria, when really it's a spectrum. All mental health is a spectrum, right? So if we talk about depression, just sort of as an example, we have everything from people feeling down on one end of the spectrum because some life event happened to clinical depression, right? And the traumatic stress is the same. And so I think that is why it often is misunderstood. I think there's also some politics behind it with the DSM-5. And I won't go too far into that, but there have been groups that have been petitioning for more examples and more diagnoses of PTSD and traumatic stress, other than there's really only a few. And that's been declined. So I think that also is a contributing factor, because when clinicians are diagnosing somebody, they don't have as many options as really they should have. So I think there's a multitude of things that are happening there. But again, I think the majority of it is, we're looking at just the most kind of severe forms of PTSD rather than the whole spectrum of traumatic stress.
Sorry, we're having a thunderstorm here. So in between, every time you're talking, I've got to mute my mic completely so that the thunder doesn't roll over. So let's go ahead and humanize this now, because let's face it, people are not statistics. And when you treat them like statistics, you're not treating them at all. So in your practice, how does this collision between traumatic stress and addiction generally manifest itself?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And, I think there's really two kind of paths that I see how these two intersect. The first I kind of have been alluding to, which is an individual with complex PTSD. And so what complex PTSD means is that they experience traumatic events and experiences when their brains and bodies were still forming. So that is 0 to 24. So our frontal lobe of our brain, our intellect, our neocortex is not fully developed until 24 to 26. So when we experience trauma, 0 to 24, the impact can be significant because it changes the way our brain and body develops. So our brain and body learns how to create workarounds, shortcuts, and ways of developing around or through that experience. And so that's what we call complex PTSD. So, what that looks like is, any number of experiences that, people may have, including loss, abuse, neglect, what have you, in their sort of environment in their youth. For the majority of those folks, and again, I'm just kind of generalizing, but everybody's different. When they start doing the typical experimenting with alcohol, with drugs, 14, 15, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, what happens is that substance actually numbs and anesthetizes their PTSD symptoms, which they didn't even realize they had, because they're typically not properly diagnosed at that point. So that may be, high anxiety levels, that may be hypervigilance, which is kind of when we're on edge, we're on watch, we're kind of always looking around. That may be feelings of insecurity, that may be, negative thoughts, that may be catastrophic thoughts. Like, we could kind of go down that list of those symptoms. So when they find drugs and alcohol, guess what? All of those symptoms temporarily disappear. And so drugs and alcohol become the solution to treating complex PTSD when you're an adolescent and you have you just really don't know what's happening. And so that is, again, one of the ways that I see how these two intersect the most. And for those folks, what that typically looks like is from day one, the way that they drink looks different than their peers. they're drinking more, they, are intoxicated more, they are the hard partier, it looks different than their peers from the beginning. Okay. And so, but in high school and college, there's a lot of normalization around excess drinking. So a lot of those folks just kind of get through it like, oh, I'm a hard partier or I'm a hard drinker, right? But they really find, as they move through kind of life stages, and maybe they get later into their 20s, maybe into their 30s, and their peers are not partying like that. Their peers are, in careers or having children, whatever that looks like, and they find themselves kind of unable to regulate their drinking. So that's kind of one example. Does that make sense, that picture?
Absolutely. And we have a comment in the chat, so I'm going to actually kind of rephrase this to you more in the sense of a question, and that's about the instance of neurodiversity being added to that substance use disorder and traumatic mix. Are you seeing a bit of that? Is that something that you're seeing is left out or starting to be more included in some of the larger studies, and how those all intermix together?
I'm not as familiar with that, and so my sense is if I haven't seen it sort of in general, it's probably not as represented as it needs to be or could be. So I haven't seen a lot of that in some of the studies. I think the challenge or just, how this works is the studies cost a lot of money, right? We're talking, typically tens of millions of dollars to conduct some of these studies. And so when it comes to trauma, the organization that has the most funding to do that is the VA. And so a lot of studies, have been centered around the military. The National Institutes of Health and some of the other agencies are doing more and more studies. But I think the neurodiversity is probably underrepresented in those studies.
And we touched on this a little bit already, but especially in the context of the more complex PTSD, do people who come to you generally just completely not know that they're suffering through traumatic stress because they're rationalizing it away as other things or just not that bad?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So let's talk about the complex PTSD folks, and then we can kind of talk about the other path, because I think that question is different, right, for each path. So here's where, again, we get into the trauma and addiction connection. So most of those complex PTSD folks then find themselves, again, in adolescence and young adulthood, drinking pretty heavily and finding themselves really struggling to get that under control, oftentimes seek treatment for it. So that is their first kind of foray into getting treatment. And so because so much of substance use treatment has been not integrated, so what happens is they're seeking treatment for they're drinking too much, maybe it's a different substance, and they are trying to do an abstinence-based program. When they do, so when they have some period of abstinence, guess what happens? Their PTSD, which is still untreated, is really the underlying issue, is now flared up, is now magnified, is now completely unmanageable. And that's why these folks really struggle with long-term recovery, whatever that recovery path looks like, unless their PTSD is properly identified and diagnosed and treated along with the substance use. And that's just been, again, a big part of my experience, and why, over the years, I have definitely steered towards medication-assisted treatment, especially the Sinclair method and these other ways of dealing with substance use, because when you have somebody that has PTSD and substance use and they just stop whatever the substance is, within a couple of months, they are dealing with untreated PTSD, and life can quickly unravel and be completely unmanageable.
And then what's the process that you typically use to help these people who are facing both of these really serious, very in-depth and internalized issues?
Yeah. Well, I look at both substance use and PTSD as chronic medical conditions that can be managed. And they're sort of like chronic health conditions, right? When they are properly managed, people can feel like they are in recovery or in remission, and people can lead very productive and happy lives. But that's the key. They're not like a broken arm where you go get it fixed and then you never think about it again. That's not how it works for either of these conditions. They are significant and they affect our brain and bodies in significant ways. And so, how that's my first sort of approach to it, right? Is really helping people, come to terms with and accept that this is something they will be managing for a lifetime. And that can be very daunting. But when we can look at it from that perspective, then people can really experience relief from symptoms and freedom from kind of the challenges that they're going through. So that's the first part. And then the second part is treating them simultaneously. So again, traditional ways of dealing with this has always been get the substance use disorder under control first. And there definitely is a time and place when that is applicable for sure. But there's oftentimes this lag. So the mental health doesn't come into it until months. And again, could be 6 months or 8 months or 9 months later. At that point, people are not able to sustain, being sort of in recovery. So I start from day one, we're treating both. And what I have found is, that is, I think, much more effective, but then it also allows for this highly kind of individualized approach. And so everybody's trauma is unique, everybody's substance use story is unique. So it's finding, the right mix of both of those treatment approaches for that individual really from day one. So I wanted to too, Jenny, if it's okay, I also wanted to talk about that second path of how I see traumatic stress and addiction connect. If that does now seem like a good time to do that.
I think now sounds like a great time for that.
Because some people listening may really identify with that first path, and then some people may be like, that's not my experience. So the second path that I see is people have normal drinking, that they're, they just sort of have normalized drinking through adolescence, young adulthood, maybe well through their 30s, but then something traumatic happens. And so the last study, which was by Kaiser Permanente, I believe in 95, that took an assessment of Americans and traumatic stress, was that over 70, I think it was 75, 76, something like that, % of Americans identified that they had experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. So again, trauma is often underreported, and that was a random sampling. So by the time people get to their 40s and maybe 50s, most people have experienced more than one traumatic event. And so I talk about that as the 4 Ds are the major traumas that people experience, which is death, divorce, disease, so some sort of health diagnosis, or downsizing, which is some sort of career, something that's impacted their career. Maybe they've been let go or, something significant with their career. So most people are going to experience that in their lifetime, right? And so that often becomes a trigger for people to experience traumatic stress. So they're later in life, they've had one of these experiences, they're in traumatic stress and they're not aware of that. And they're reaching for alcohol to soothe the symptoms of traumatic stress. And so that's kind of the other path. And so what happens is we are particularly vulnerable when we are in traumatic stress to become dependent on substances. So I always tell people the worst time to reach for a substance is when you feel stressed out. And yet that is what is norm in our culture. People do it every day, all day long, right? You know, I had a stressful day at work. I'm going to come home and I'm going to have a couple of glasses of wine to unwind from that stress. But it is when our brain is most susceptible and vulnerable to becoming hooked into, in an unhealthy way, a substance. So for those folks, what I typically find is that, you know, a year after this traumatic event, their drinking has progressed. They're wanting to rein it back in and they're unable to. And that can last, you know, for months or for years at a time, before those folks, again, will seek help for the drinking, not recognizing that what's really happening is they're treating their traumatic stress.
So, and I know you've touched on how you approach this, but I want you to frame this in terms of effectiveness. This is coming from our audience, and that's how effective can trauma be addressed when someone's still in active addiction? My doctor and psychiatrist interrupted treatment sessions until alcohol would be out of the picture.
Great question. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we find in the treatment, you know, in treating individuals. So there's sort of two answers to that. And it depends on what method of treatment individuals are doing for alcohol use disorder. If individuals are doing an abstinence-based method, which again, I don't know the exact figures, but the vast majority of treatment out there for alcohol use is abstinent-based, okay? That is the standard, method of treatment, is get the alcohol out of the way before you treat trauma. So it's understandable. If people are intoxicated, there's not really a whole lot of benefit to trying to do mental health treatment at that time, but it's also a little bit too simplistic, and things are not always that black and white. So how I approach it is that, as I mentioned, from day one, I am treating both. And so trauma treatment starts with the foundation of education and diagnoses. And so my particular training, we did, or I was trained in, and I still use what's called a triphasic model of treatment for trauma. And so it just means that there's 3 phases to it, right? So that first phase is called the foundation. And the main 3 goals of that is education, assessment, and skill building. So I start day one with doing those things. Even if somebody is still struggling with getting to abstinence and getting the substance use under control, because those things will help them get the substance use under control. So education, assessment, and coping skills, skill building, is going to be helpful for both. And so that's really where I start. And if somebody, again, is doing an abstinence-based modality, that period of time of them detoxing and getting to abstinence is very short. That's just days. If somebody is doing a harm reduction model, the Sinclair method, right? Those 2 go hand in hand, in that we're doing that phase 1 of trauma treatment while they are doing their extinction process with the Sinclair method. So those 2 really dovetail nicely. Phase 2 of trauma treatment is what most people think of, which is when you are actually processing traumatic material. You are doing that deeper therapy where you are going into the material, you're processing it, you're moving it in the brain, you're getting it out of the muscle and the tissue in the bodies. That is not done until somebody is either abstinent or at their goal with the Sinclair method. Because that would be harmful to do that while somebody is still struggling with an active sort of substance issue. So I hope that clarifies. And if there's any other questions about that, I'm happy to explain further.
And I would think that, I know that we run across a lot of misconceptions just in the alcohol use disorder realm. And I imagine that trauma is the same. So would you mind speaking about any of the misconceptions you often run into?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that we've already alluded to it, is that people compare their experience of trauma, and they think that what they've experienced is not bad enough. So again, people's first thoughts when they think of PTSD or they think of trauma are some of the most severe experiences: combat and or experiencing, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, but at a very severe level. And so anything other than those two things, people say, I don't have trauma. And so there's just, again, this really kind of misconception around a traumatic stress is a spectrum. And it's not about the event. It's not about the facts and circumstances of the event. It's about how your brain and body reacted to the event. And so you could have two people that experience the exact same event, and one person will have traumatic stress and one person will not. That happens all the time because there are about 10 different factors that the brain and body sort of, they filter. It goes through this like checklist and filter. And if you get enough check marks, the brain and body is going to react in fight, flight, or freeze. And so I spend so much time in that first phase of education, really helping people see that they do in fact have traumatic stress, even if they haven't had those experiences. And so there's a couple of ways that I do that. And I think the most helpful way that I'll just kind of speak to right now is I use a particular assessment that's called the Trauma Symptom Inventory Assessment. So it's 36 questions. It's pretty in depth. And it asks you nothing about the actual event. And all it does is assess your symptoms. And then it gives you a report and a score. That's pretty, irrefutable. When people can see it in an assessment on black and white, these are the symptoms, criteria for PTSD, here's your score. Then it helps them start to really kind of grasp this idea that they probably have been dealing with traumatic stress, again, even if they haven't actually been in combat.
And do you find that when people see the quantification, does that help alleviate some of the internal, because you talk about people comparing, oh, it's not that bad. But I would also imagine that there's also a bit of kind of guilt or shame internalized, thinking that, oh, well, maybe it's me. I mean, we gaslight ourselves all the time. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm blowing it out of proportion. Maybe I'm making it a bigger deal. Oh, people always said I make mountains out of molehills. So do you find that that really helps people to stop the internal blame shame game?
Yes. Oh, such a good point. I do. And it helps to break the stigma around mental health, which people still have that stigma that mental health is a willpower issue and that I should just get over whatever it is. I should just be able to handle it or manage it. And if I'm unable to, that's because there's something wrong with me, or I'm somehow deficient and I'm not strong enough, or I'm weak, or whatever those kind of negative thoughts are. And I do find that it's liberating for people to recognize that they have they have a sort of validated, medical/mental health issue that they've been trying to deal with on their own, with no resources, with no support, with not even understanding what they're dealing with. And that this is why they've been unsuccessful. And there's a sense of relief around that. And to your point, I think that the guilt and shame can sometimes linger, and sometimes that's needs a little bit more attention. I think so many of us grew up with, well, there's starving kids in Africa kind of a mentality, which is so not helpful. And sometimes, again, that can take a little bit of time and a little bit of work to change that perspective. But it's a good point that people oftentimes have guilt and shame. But again, if we can take this out of, this is sort of a strength issue, character, willpower, and just put this into sort of the medical realm. And, I think that helps people.
And I've often just casually asserted that, living through trauma just kind of breaks our flight, freeze mechanism. Yes. Is that like, granted, that is a vast oversimplification. It's like the button's broken and it doesn't always work where it's supposed to anymore. But are there any practical things someone can do to kind of self-assess at first to figure out maybe they do need to look at their reactions and figure out if it's something that they should seek help for? So what are some of those things that people can do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first and foremost is to just do some research online of the signs and symptoms of traumatic stress, right? And not the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So again, that's the more kind of severe end of the spectrum, but looking at signs and symptoms of chronic stress, traumatic stress. So I think that's a good place to start. I think the other tool that people can reference is EMDR, their website in the EMDRIA organization, which is the EMDR International Association. That's what EMDRIA stands for. So they have a lot of resources on their website too. And they have some good handouts that talk about kind of what happens when your brain is in a traumatic stress state. How EMDR can be helpful with that. So I think that's another good place. And what I would encourage people to do if they are interested, then taking the next step after that, which is possibly, seeking out an individual for therapy or counseling, is to find somebody off of the EMDRIA website, or find somebody that is a specialist in trauma treatment. And there's, probably over 20 different certifications that people can have. So I can't tell people, all of them to look for. But EMDRIA and somebody who is certified in EMDR is a great place to start, because those folks are going to understand how to, again, properly identify and diagnose and then treat trauma. Unfortunately, just somebody who is, gone through graduate school in counseling or social work, they may have as little as one class in trauma. So if 60 credit hours, maybe only 3 of them is around trauma. So you really need somebody that has more training than that, and has some advanced certifications or degrees. And then just make an appointment with them and, let them know, hey, I don't know, but this is what I'm thinking. Can you help me, sort of navigate this?
And we know that trauma and traumatic stress can present itself through addiction. But what are other ways that this stress can affect a person, both physically and mentally?
Yeah, well, let's go back to fight, flight, freeze. And so, how it can affect individuals, if we kind of remove the sort of addiction piece of it for a moment and just look at the mental health piece, is looking at being locked into chronic states of fight, flight, or freeze is a really helpful way to look at it. So let's start with fight. So what do we know about the fight reaction? Is that when our nervous system goes into fight, it produces very high levels of adrenaline and cortisol, and neuroepinephrine, the CAN hormones, CAN hormones. Okay. And so when somebody is in a state where they have an excess of those hormones in their body and they are in a fight mode, that can look like people with anger management issues, right? People who are really struggling to deal with their the reactions to things that come out as anger. People who have significant road rage, right? We unfortunately have all kinds of examples of, what uncontrolled anger looks like, in our society. And so, with that fight kind of response, it tends to be people who are pretty, they have high levels of energy, high levels of anger, high levels of aggression, and that can lead to all kinds of difficulties, certainly in relationships, certainly in career. It's hard to, have a successful job or career when you're finding yourself, really at a 9 out of 10 anger over small things. Or when you find yourself in the red zone, right? I kind of call that the red zone, meaning you're so angry that sometimes you are doing and saying things and you don't even realize that you're doing and saying them. By the time your brain kind of catches up, you've already done and said things, right? So that's kind of the fight response. The flight response can oftentimes look like high anxiety as well. And it can manifest itself in people being unable to sustain relationships, unable to sustain careers, jobs, because their brain and body is telling them to get out and get away. So again, this can look like people, changing jobs every few months, every year or so, people moving, people getting out of relationships, unable to sustain long-term relationships. And again, it's because their brain and body is telling them when there's danger, flee, go away. Okay. So that's kind of more long-term, what the flight response can look like. And then freeze response, I think probably the simplest way to talk about that is it can look like depression, and it can actually be sort of chronic depression. People feel very immobilized. They feel unable to, really sort of function in their life, or they just feel stuck. Maybe they're functioning, but it's at a level that they're unhappy, but they don't have the motivation, they don't have the energy, they don't have the ability to kind of get unstuck. So they feel kind of just frozen, kind of stuck wherever they are. And even though they may be unhappy about that.
And then in any of those, it seems a bit simple to see how the addition of an addiction to any of those 3 distinct ways of reacting can then not only intensify that, but to create additional trauma on top of that. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's again, it's a more kind of complex in that initially substances relieve those symptoms, and that's why people go back to them over and over and over, right? So, you may get 2 hours of relief if you are in that fight category and you're so keyed up and you're aggressive and you drink alcohol. Well, alcohol is a sedative. So, guess what? That could bring all of that down. And so, initially, it's like, thumbs up, this is great, right? But it doesn't really end there, right? If it stopped there, this would be a whole different conversation. And so then what happens as, alcohol continues to metabolize and as alcohol use disorder continues down the progressive spectrum, because I'm not sure if, all the users recognize, but it is progressive because of what's happening in the brain. So it will continue to get worse, right? So then that creates all kinds of complications and all kinds of problems. And, being intoxicated obviously can create severe consequences, whether those are traumas around driving, DUIs, accidents. Obviously, relationships are affected, people's health, career. I mean, there's really no aspect of life that isn't affected when, somebody finds them in this chronic state of using a substance. But initially, there's a brief reprieve, but then chronic use of it creates more problems, more traumas.
Sorry, almost did not get off of mute there for a moment. Um, so, what can someone do right now if they are in recovery and they're trying to learn how to cope with traumatic stress?
Yeah, I think similar to what we were saying before is find someone who this is their specialty. And there are so many well-intentioned mental health professionals that, again, are well-intentioned, but don't have the training to treat trauma. And it's not something you can treat if you've had one class of it in college, right? And it's impossible for mental health professionals to be experts in everything. It's just like doctors. We wouldn't expect a doctor, to an MD to be a specialist in, neurosurgery and also be a specialist in endocrinology. We understand that that takes a lot of additional training. Mental health is the same. So it's really about finding someone who can guide you and navigate the recovery process with you and give you guidance and help you tap into and plug into resources that are specific to your traumatic stress, because everybody's traumatic stress is different, and certain, tools or resources may be helpful for one person and not for another person. So that's where I would start. And again, the EMDRIA website is helpful. I also tell people go to Psychology Today, because that's the biggest website that you can search for mental health professionals, and they have a lot of filters. So put in the filters. Somebody is a specialist in trauma, look for those credentials.
And on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it for an individual to internalize that their trauma is not their fault?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 10, being that it's extremely important. And that, for so many experiences of trauma, there is an automatic belief that gets generated or created while we are in fight, flight, or freeze that says it is our fault. And so for really the vast majority of people, that piece of it needs to be addressed. Rarely, but it does happen. People go through trauma and walk away from it saying, I recognize it's not my fault, but that's really the exception. And I think it's incredibly important because how we view ourselves, our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-value is impacted when we think a trauma is our fault.
Wow, that it's hard to believe, but it looks like we are just about out of time. Audience, you guys have been wonderful as always. It has been a huge crowd out there today. Thank you all for spending the last hour with us. And go ahead and put in the chat any advice you're going to take from today. We'd love to know that and hear your feedback. And please join me in thanking our wonderful guest, Gabrielle Loomis-Annett. Any last words for our audience before we end the show?
Well, just thanks, Jenny. And I'm really heartened to hear that there's a lot of folks out there that was listening to this. And so, my takeaway is the more that we have these conversations, the more that people get better. And that's what it's all about. So thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And audience, let's fill the chat area with some gratitude for Gabrielle. We really do hope you're walking away with some helpful, insightful information. If you guys came in late or you want to share or watch the stream again, we're going to have today's video up on our website, YouTube, Vimeo, Anchor, and Spotify, hopefully all by the end of today. And as soon as we're able to, we will get the transcripts and closed captioning added as well. Next week, we're going to be joined by Christina Veselik from the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition, and we're going to talk a bit about the role of nutrition in recovery. So start thinking about those questions now. If you guys have found value in the broadcast, we hope you'll hit the donate button in our profile or head to our website and make a donation at c3foundation.org/donate. You can also follow our channel to get broadcast alerts and subscribe to our channel to go ad-free and get some bonus emoji to use. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can subscribe for free. If you'd like to suggest a guest or topic for our upcoming 3rd season this fall, we've got a link to a Google form that drops in the chat, and you can find that link on our main schedule page on our website. If you're on the Sinclair method and looking for more peer support, or if you just want to join the C3 Foundation community, we have you covered with groups on Facebook, Discord, and the Options Save Lives forum. So everybody, that is it for today. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Be gentle with yourself and with others, and I will see you again right here next week on Twitch at noon Eastern. Bye, everybody. You've been watching the Options Save Lives weekly live stream, hosted by Executive Director Jenny Williamson and produced by the C3 Foundation with the support of R Street Institute and other generous supporters. For more information about the C3 Foundation or the Sinclair Method, visit our website at c3foundation.org. If you have a question you want answered live on air, to make guest suggestions, or to support the show, let us know. You can reach us through our website, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or on Discord. Join us each week as we continue to discuss more ways to help you build a better relationship with alcohol, or to eliminate it completely. Because recovery from alcohol use disorder is not a one-size-fits-all process. Options are available, and options save lives.